Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Close your eyes for a moment and imagine something. Imagine you are standing in the middle of a hive city at the edge of the galaxy. The air is thick. Not thick like humidity, not the kind of thickness that comes from a warm summer evening. This is something else. The kind of thickness that coats the inside of your throat. The kind that makes every breath feel slightly wrong, like the air itself has been changed at a molecular level into something that isn't quite air anymore. The lights above you flicker weakly. Somewhere far below you in the depths of the city, millions of people are going about their lives in the usual, grinding misery of imperial existence, praying to a distant god on a golden throne who may or may not hear them, doing the same work they did yesterday and will do tomorrow, yet never once allowing themselves to feel genuine hope, because hope in the 41st millennium is a luxury most cannot afford. And then you hear something. It's a sound that doesn't belong. A low, wet, shuffling sound coming from around the corner of a narrow corridor. The sound of something dragging its feet. The sound of labored breathing that isn't quite breathing. The sound of something that should not be moving, but is. You back against the wall. Your hand finds the grip of your laspistol. The shuffling grows louder. More of them now. A dozen. Maybe more. And then they round the corner, and you see them for the first time. They were human once. You can still see that. One of them wears the overalls of a manufactory worker, still stained with engine grease, though now also stained with other things. Another wears the torn remnants of an arbitrator's uniform. A child, no older than 8 years, with glassy grey eyes and a smile permanently carved into a face that rot has frozen in that expression. They move with that awful, lurching gait. No urgency, no panic, no self-preservation. They simply come, because coming is the only thing left in them. And as they get closer, you notice it, the smell. Not just decay, you know the smell of decay. This is something beneath that, something behind the rot, like a frequency your body registers before your conscious mind catches up. It is the smell of something that has reached into the spiritual dimension and pulled the very concept of corruption into physical form. It is the smell of what happens when a god decides to express himself through disease. Welcome to the curse of unbelief. This is the oldest, most insidious, and in many ways the most terrifying weapon in the arsenal of Nurgle. The chaos god of disease, decay, and the dark comfort of despair. The zombie plague, to give it its most common name, though it carries dozens across the shattered breadth of the Imperium of man, is not merely a biological threat. It is not something that can be cured by the apothecaries of the Adeptus Mechanicus, not something that better filtration and cleaner living conditions will address. It is a weapon that exists at the intersection of the physical and the spiritual. It is a punishment for those who have lost the most basic thing that keeps a human soul from becoming a doorway for the darkness. Faith. That is the terrible heart of this plague. That is why it carries the name it does. The curse of unbelief does not strike at the strongest. It does not primarily target soldiers or champions or the devout. It finds the cracks in a civilization and fills them like dark water, finding every fault in a stone wall. It finds the dispossessed worker who has begun to wonder, in the small hours of the night, whether the emperor truly cares about people like him. It finds the grieving mother who has watched 3 children die of preventable sickness and has started to feel, deep down in a place she would never admit to anyone, a cold and silent fury at the god who allowed it. It finds the soldier who has fought 100 battles and survived them all, and now lies awake in the dark, trying to remember what he was fighting for, because the reason has worn away like paint in the rain. These are Nurgle's preferred victims, but not the wicked, not the heretical, the simply exhausted, the quietly despairing. The ones who haven't turned away from the Emperor so much as they have simply run out of the energy to face toward him. In an empire of 1,000,000 worlds, where the gears of civilization grind on human lives like millstones, where the life of an individual citizen barely registers against the vast statistical ocean of humanity, where billions live and die in squalor and pain and incomprehension. In such an empire, the curse of unbelief does not lack for suitable hosts. The vast majority of the Imperium's population carries a vulnerability to this plague simply by virtue of living the lives they live. And so the dead rise. They rise in the underhives of hive cities, where the light never reaches and the air systems broke down 3 generations ago. They rise on agri-worlds devastated by failed harvests and crippling imperial tithes. They rise on besieged worlds where the defenders have spent weeks in terror and exhaustion, watching their lines shrink, their ammunition dwindle, their comrades fall. They rise wherever the great machinery of humanity's survival has failed to tend to the actual spiritual state of the humans it was meant to protect. They rise, and they spread. And the truly terrifying thing, the thing that inquisitors of the Ordo Sepulturum will tell you in hushed, carefully chosen words, is that this is all working exactly as intended. Nurgle designed it this way. There is something uniquely horrifying about a weapon that is also a theology. Most weapons are honest about what they are. A bolter round does not pretend to be offering you something. A power sword does not speak to you before it kills you. But the zombie plague is not just a weapon. It is an argument. It is a competing doctrine, a dark mirror to the faith that the ecclesiarchy preaches from its pulpits. Where the ministorum says the emperor loves you and will protect you if you believe hard enough and long enough and consistently enough, the plague says something quieter and, in its own horrible way, kinder. It says that you are already suffering, that protection did not come, that the love you were promised has no observable effects in the world you actually inhabit, and that perhaps the appropriate response to this reality is not more faith, but its opposite. In the context of a galaxy that is genuinely as dark as the 41st millennium, that argument lands. It lands in places that doctrine cannot reach. And it lands in the quiet parts of people who are outwardly pious and inwardly exhausted, who perform all the required prayers and attend all the required ceremonies and say all the required words, because they know that the alternative is the Inquisition, but who lie awake in the dark, wondering if any of it is real. The plague finds those people, not immediately, not dramatically. It does not arrive with a fanfare of revelation that converts the doubting to the darkness. It is far more patient than that. It simply waits. It circulates through the population of a community, finding the spiritually weak the way water finds cracks in a ceiling, not because it seeks them with intelligence, but because the path of least resistance leads exactly there. And when the conditions are right, when the despair has accumulated to the necessary threshold, when the number of vulnerable souls in a given area reaches the critical mass that the warp energy of the plague requires to establish a self-sustaining infection chain, it begins. And then the dead rise. The Imperium has had 10,000 years to develop responses to the zombie plague. The propaganda notices, the burn protocols, the quarantine procedures, the Ordo Sepulturum, established specifically to deal with this threat. Generations of military doctrine codified for fighting the walking dead. And still, worlds fall. Still, the mathematics of exponential infection defeat local capacity for containment. Still, plague fleets find vulnerable populations and turn them inside out. Because you cannot bomb a theology. You cannot shoot a vulnerability. You cannot quarantine despair. What you can do is understand it as completely and clearly as possible, so that when it comes for the worlds in your care, you know exactly what you are dealing with and exactly what tools you actually have for the fight. That understanding is what we are building tonight, one layer at a time, beginning at the very source. Tonight, we are going down into the history, the science, the spirituality, and the absolute horror of the zombie plague. We are going to trace it from its theological roots, in the nature of the plague God himself, through the catastrophic events of the Horus heresy that created its most devoted spreaders through 10,000 years of infection and suffering, all the way to the present day, where the Great Rift has cracked the galaxy open like an egg, and new strains of this ancient darkness are finding victims that the original plague could never have reached. Settle in, light a candle if you have one, put on something warm, because by the time this is over, you are going to understand exactly why the Imperium of Man posts propaganda notices on every public board that read, "All deceased must be burned within 6 minutes of death to prevent reanimation." And you are going to understand exactly why people sometimes don't follow that instruction. Part 2. Grandfather Nurgle, the god behind the plague. Before we can talk about what the zombie plague is, we need to talk about who made it. Or more accurately, who it serves. Nurgle goes by many names. The Plague Lord, the Lord of Decay, Grandfather Nurgle, Papa Nurgle. The Fly Lord, the Great Corruptor, the Master of Plague and Pestilence. Each of these names tells you something different about him, and taken together they paint a picture of something genuinely strange and genuinely unsettling. A god that defies the simple category of evil. Because here is the thing about Nurgle that catches people off guard the first time they encounter his lore. He is not a god of hatred. He is not a god of cruelty in the deliberate, sadistic sense that Slaanesh is, or wrath in the explosive, consuming way that Khorne is. Nurgle is, in the most genuine and disturbing sense of the phrase, a god of love. He loves his followers. He genuinely, deeply, overwhelmingly loves every single one of them. He thinks of them as his children, his grandchildren, his beloved family, and his enthusiasm for their welfare is boundless. He celebrates their progress. He delights in their accomplishments. He mourns their setbacks. He wants nothing more than for all of them to feel safe, warm, protected, and welcome in the great rotting garden of his existence. The problem, and it is quite a significant problem, is that his love expresses itself through plague, corruption, decay, and the systematic destruction of everything that makes life worth living. This contradiction is the engine that makes Nurgle so philosophically interesting and so cosmically dangerous. He is not wrong that entropy is real. He is not wrong that all things decay. He is not wrong that the universe moves relentlessly toward dissolution. Every civilization that has ever risen has fallen. Every body eventually returns to the earth it came from. Every star will eventually exhaust itself and go dark. These are true things. And Nurgle, unlike most of the other Chaos gods, has oriented himself toward truths rather than lies. His argument, stripped to its essentials, is this: suffering comes from resisting the inevitable. You suffer because you hold on to things that will be taken from you. You suffer because you fear death, because you fear disease, because you fear the loss of everything you love. And so he offers a gift. He offers acceptance. He offers a state of consciousness in which you have embraced decay so thoroughly that you no longer fear it. You are already rotting. You are already dying. And in that knowledge, he promises, there is a terrible peace. The catch, of course, is that this peace comes at the cost of everything that makes you who you are. By the time Nurgle's gifts have fully transformed a follower, as the person who originally sought refuge in his embrace is gone, what remains is a vessel of pestilence, cheerful and contented in the way that the thoroughly broken can sometimes seem cheerful and contented because they have stopped fighting. Nurgle exists in the warp, the psychic dimension that underlies all of physical reality in the 40K universe, as an entity of immense power whose strength waxes and wanes with the intensity of disease and despair across the mortal realm. When plagues spread, when populations sicken, when hope drains away from millions of hearts simultaneously, Nurgle grows stronger. His realm in the warp expands. The garden blooms. And what a garden it is. The domain of Nurgle is described in forbidden texts as a vast, festering, impossibly complex ecosystem of death and rebirth. Twisted forests of wood that is more meat than timber, threaded through with the kind of bioluminescent fungi that pulse with a faint, sick light. Swamps that bubble with chemical compositions that would kill an unprotected human in seconds, yet teem with an impossible diversity of insect life. Rivers that move slowly, thick with substances you would rather not name, carrying nutrients of a deeply unsettling nature to the roots of trees that have grown for millennia on the graves of things that died before humanity reached the stars. At the heart of this garden stands the blighted mansion of misery and mirth, ancient, enormous, built from timber that rots and regrows simultaneously, from stones that are crusted with the calcified remains of things that died against them long ago and were absorbed rather than cleaned away. This is Nurgle's home. This is where he works. Beneath its sagging beams, this vast bloated deity stirs an iron cauldron that would comfortably swallow a small building. The cauldron contains an ever-changing soup of every disease, every pestilence, every plague that has ever existed, or that Nurgle has ever imagined. He stirs it with a ladle fashioned from something that was once alive and still might be. He tastes his work. He adjusts it. He experiments with new vectors of transmission, new symptoms, new progression rates. He is not malicious in this process. He is genuinely enthusiastic, genuinely excited, the way a master chef is excited about a new recipe, or the way a craftsman takes deep satisfaction in a tool that performs exactly as intended. When he has created something he is pleased with, he takes it to the corner of his workshop where he keeps Isha, the ancient Aeldari goddess of healing and fertility, whom he captured long ago and keeps imprisoned here, fed his latest creations, so he can watch how efficiently she fights them off. She is, in his mind, both his test subject and his companion, and his affection for her, in his deeply warped understanding of that concept, is genuine. She endures. She fights off each new plague with her divine healing, and in doing so she whispers the cures to the mortal realm, which is why new diseases never quite eradicate their victims entirely. But the diseases that survive even the scrutiny of a goddess of healing, those are the ones that Nurgle releases upon the universe, and then they rain down. Nurgle's portfolio of diseases in the 40K universe is staggering, though the zombie plague and its descendant strains represent just one branch of a catalogue that includes hundreds of named contagions and untold thousands of unnamed ones. There is Nurgle's rot, the most fundamental of his gifts, which is not merely a physical disease but a spiritual one, a corruption that slowly dissolves a mortal being into the raw material for a new plague-bearer demon. There is the Destroyer Plague that decimated the Death Guard during the Horus Heresy. There is Bone Rack, Eye Rot, the Stench Gut Plague, the Loathsome Pox, the Gurgling Doom, Brain Fever, Brittle Coma, the Fly-Blown Palsy, Yellow Dementia, the Red Flux, the Ochre Pox. Each one a masterwork, each one a gift. The garden that surrounds his mansion deserves more time, because understanding it helps you understand the philosophy behind the zombie plague. In the most forbidden and closely held descriptions, the accounts of those rare individuals who have somehow survived a visit to Nurgle's realm and returned with their minds even partially intact. The garden is not primarily a place of ugliness. It is beautiful, grotesquely, wrongly, uncomfortably beautiful. The fungi that push through the leaf mulch of the forest floor glow with their own soft light. The river that winds between the trees, thick with materials that would be fatal to breathe, runs with a kind of dark iridescence, like oil on water. The insects that fill the air, the vast, black, buzzing clouds of Nurgle's beloved flies, move in patterns that suggest something almost musical. Death feeds life here. The decay of one thing is the precondition for the emergence of something else. Every corpse is the soil for new growth. Every disease is the opening act for a new form of resilience in whatever survives it. In Nurgle's cosmology, this is not contradiction. It is the central truth of existence. The universe is not a place of clean lines and permanent victories. It is a place of cycles and the plague. God's ambition in its most grandiose form, is not to kill everything, but to complete the cycle, to bring the universe to the stage of its greatest rot, so that from that rot, something new and wonderful, something wholly his, can emerge. His children, the demons of Nurgle, the plague bearers with their single eyes and their plague swords, the rotund beasts of Nurgle, whose affection for their living playthings inevitably kills them, the great unclean ones who lumber through real space, and the garden alike carrying their master's essence in every drop of what oozes from their bodies. These are not primarily soldiers, they are tenders, gardeners. They maintain the ecosystem of decay that Nurgle has built with the same kind of devotion that a groundskeeper maintains a formal garden. Except the things they tend are contagions, and the things that grow from their work are death. The zombie plague, though, occupies a special place in Nurgle's arsenal because it does something unique. It does not merely kill its victims. It does not merely transform them into something grotesque. It keeps them moving after death. It keeps them spreading the infection. It ensures that each death becomes a new soldier in an army that grows precisely as fast as it kills. Yet in Nurgle's theological framework, this is beautiful. Death is not an end, it is a transformation. The dead do not leave his garden, they become part of it. And in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, where death comes for so many so young, the promise that death is not the end carries a terrible appeal to those who have lost too much and loved too deeply to accept oblivion. It is a lie, of course. What rises after the plague takes you is not you. It is the shell of you, animated by warp energy, driven by the most primitive impulse the plague has left behind, hunger for living flesh, and guided by a subtle psychic network that connects all the infected to each other, and faintly to the sorcerers who know how to tune into that frequency. You do not return. But something wearing your face does. At Part 3, The Death Guard, How Rot Was Born. The zombie plague did not emerge from nothing. It has deep roots in one of the darkest chapters of the Imperium's history, the Horus Heresy, and those roots reach down through the corrupted souls of a Space Marine legion that was once among the most stalwart and capable warriors in humanity's arsenal, the Death Guard. Before their fall, before the rot, before everything, they were known by a different name. The Dusk Raiders, a legion born from the warrior clans of ancient terror, renowned even among their superhuman peers for an almost inhuman capacity to absorb punishment, to endure suffering, to keep fighting long after any reasonable assessment would suggest they should have stopped. Their gene seed granted them bodies of extraordinary resilience. Their training and doctrine amplified this natural toughness into a philosophy, a way of being in the world. Where other legions celebrated speed or precision or tactical genius, the Dusk Raiders celebrated simply not dying. They were the anvil on which enemies broke themselves. They were the wall that held when everything else had given way. Then they were reunited with their Primarch, and they became the Death Guard. Mortarion is one of the most tragic figures in all of Warhammer lore, and his story is worth understanding because it contains the seed of everything that would later go so catastrophically wrong. He was found on Barbarous, a world so thoroughly poisoned by millennia of industrial and magical contamination that its lower altitudes were uninhabitable to unprotected humans. The aristocracy of this world, powerful psychers and sorcerers of deeply corrupted ability, lived in the high peaks above the toxic fog, and they fed on the human population below, who lived and died in the valleys beneath clouds that killed anything that breathed them too long. Mortarion grew up in that valley. He grew up breathing air that should have killed him. He grew up building an immune system that processed the valley's poisons and converted them into strength, because the alternative was death, and he refused to die. He grew up hating the lords in the high peaks with an intensity that would shape every decision he ever made. He trained an army of the valley's survivors. He waged a campaign of liberation from below, killing his way up through the toxic clouds. Watching his soldiers die of exposure while he himself walked forward through the poison like it was nothing. Because for him, it was nothing. He was winning. He was winning right up until the final confrontation, when he cornered the last and most powerful of Barbaros's overlords, his own adoptive father, the sorcerer who had taken him in as a foundling child and raised him as an experiment, as proof that even something as fragile as a human could be made hard enough to survive. And he could not finish it. The magic that protected the overlord was beyond even Mortarian's extraordinary resistance. He stood in the killing mists, unable to advance, unable to retreat, and he knew he was dying. The Emperor arrived. The Emperor who had been watching from a distance with the particular patience of someone who knew how this story would end, and who had been waiting for exactly this moment, stepped forward and finished the fight in seconds. And he handed Mortarion what he had spent his whole life fighting for. He handed him a victory he had not earned. Mortarion never forgave him for that. The grudge festered for years, decades, centuries. Mortarion bent his knee and swore loyalty, because what else could he do? But the resentment coiled in him like something living. The Emperor had denied him his proof that he was strong enough, his proof that he could survive anything, endure anything, overcome anything on his own merits, without the intervention of the Emperor's impossible powers. And so when Horus began his rebellion, when the whisper network of traitors began to move through the legions, Mortarion's old wound was there to be exploited. It didn't take much, and just enough pressure on exactly the right scar. The Death Guard joined the heresy. What followed would have been the final chapter of the Death Guard's story, had it simply been a story about military betrayal. But Nurgle had been watching the 14th Legion for a long time. He had noticed their philosophy of endurance. He had appreciated their contempt for weakness, their embrace of suffering as a state to be transcended rather than avoided. He had observed, with the particular interest of a god who understood these things better than anyone, that there was something in the Death Guard that was almost like his own theology, a belief that you became strong by accepting pain rather than fleeing from it, that the truest measure of a warrior was how much he could absorb and keep going. He had been waiting for the right moment, the right trap. The trap was set by Mortarion's first captain, a man named Callus Typhon, who had been secretly devoted to the ruinous powers since long before the heresy, converted, allegedly, by Erebus of the Word Bearers, one of the great architects of Horus's rebellion. Typhon had hidden his psychic abilities from Mortarion, who despised psychers with the deep and irrational hatred of someone who had grown up watching what uncontrolled psychic power did to an innocent population. Typhon was patient. He played his role. He waited. When the Death Guard fleet set out for Terra to join the final assault on the Imperial Palace, Typhon murdered the Legion's navigators. He told Mortarion they had been discovered to be traitors still loyal to the Emperor, and he told his Primarch he could guide the fleet through the warp himself. He was lying, of course. What he did instead was lead the entire fleet of the Death Guard into a warp storm from which there was no exit. He becalmed them in the Imperium, stranded between reality and the screaming chaos of the psychic dimension, drifting without purpose or direction through a place that should not be navigated without the specialized gifts of a navigator. Days passed, weeks. The Death Guard waited with the grim endurance they were known for, trusting their Primarch, trusting their training, trusting that they would find a way out. And then the Destroyer Plague came. It came slowly. A cough here, a fever there. Something noticed in the skin, a slight discoloration, a texture that was different to the touch. Then worse. The bellies of Space Marines, warriors whose biology was so heavily enhanced that they were supposed to be functionally immune to all conventional disease, began to swell with corruption. Their flesh softened in ways flesh should not soften. The ships themselves began to decay, their walls sweating a kind of foul moisture that had no mechanical explanation. Warriors who had survived battlefields that would have shattered entire conventional armies found themselves collapsing from something they could not fight, could not hit, could not burn, could not blast with the weapons of war. They were dying of rot. Plague Marines are famous today as walking, unstoppable engines of corruption, and there is a terrible irony in the fact that the thing that made them what they are was the same experience that would have, under any normal circumstances, destroyed them, as the Death Guard endured. They kept going because that was all they knew how to do. They suffered agonies that stretched on for days, weeks, unable to die because their enhanced physiology kept their damaged bodies functioning long past the point where any mercy would have permitted death. They lay in their own dissolution, in the running fluids of their own corruption, and they waited. Mortarion held out the longest. Of course he did. He was the Primarch. He breathed poison for pleasure. He had spent his entire life mastering the art of not being destroyed by what was trying to destroy him. But even he broke. In the end, in the deepest hour of whatever counted as night in the warp, surrounded by his rotting legion on ships that were coming apart around them, Mortarion called out to the powers of the warp. He did not call out with hope. But he did not do it with faith or devotion or any particular theological conviction. He did it because his sons were suffering, and he had run out of other options, and because the Lord of Decay had been there the whole time, waiting for exactly this moment, and his offer of relief was the only offer being made. Nurgle answered. The flies came first, billions of them, materializing from the warp-soaked air of the ships, swarming through the corridors, entering the bodies of the stricken legion through every available opening. And then, somehow, impossibly, the Death Guard began to stand. The rot did not leave them. The swelling and the corruption and the suppurating wounds and the bloated, decomposing flesh. All of that remained. But the pain stopped. The agony that had been consuming them was simply gone. And in its place was the cold, a heavy piece of something that has accepted what it is. They would never feel pain again. They would never fear death again. They would never fear anything again, because the things they feared had already happened to them, and they were still standing. Nurgle had not cured them. He had transformed them. They arrived at Terra as something the Imperium had never seen before, not quite living, not quite dead, bloated and rotting within their power armor, carrying within their bodies enough disease to level entire star systems, immune to the conventional weapons of war, in ways that went beyond their already extraordinary resilience. They fought in the siege of Terra as aberrations, as things that should not exist, and they carved their mark into the Imperium's history in letters that stank of decay. The Horus heresy ended. Horus fell. Yet the traitor legions fled into the Eye of Terror, and the Death Guard, led by Mortarion, now himself ascending toward demonhood, his soul so thoroughly claimed by Nurgle that the distinction between him and the Plague God's will had become theoretical, retreated to a world deep within the Eye, a world they would shape in the image of lost Barbarous, a world they called the Plague Planet. From there, they would launch 10,000 years of infection. Part 4. Typhus, the Traveller, the Herald who spreads the curse. Of all the Death Guard's champions, the one most directly responsible for the spread of the zombie plague across the galaxy is not Mortarion. It is his wayward son, his prodigal champion, the entity who was once Callous Typhon and is now known as Typhus, the Traveller, Herald of Nurgle, host of the Destroyer Hive, and the living vector through whom the curse of unbelief has become one of the most feared weapons in the galaxy's history. Typhon's origins are important because they illuminate something about how corruption works in the 40,000 universe. He was not a simple villain. He was not straightforwardly evil from the beginning. He was a man of immense capability and deeply buried wounds, born on Barbarous like Mortarion himself, carrying in his blood the taint of the world's terrible former rulers. He had psychic abilities he could not openly acknowledge. He had ambitions that could not be satisfied within the hierarchy of a legion devoted to the Emperor. He had, somewhere underneath everything else, the deep and abiding conviction that the universe was a place of rot and suffering, and that the only honest response to that fact was to make peace with the rot rather than fight it. Erebus found him, or he found Erebus. The accounts vary. What is clear is that long before the heresy officially began, Carlos Typhon had already sworn himself to chaos, was already working within the Death Guard as a deep cover agent of the ruinous powers, and had already begun the patient, years-long work of preparing his legion for what he knew was coming. He was efficient. He was methodical. He was, in the specific way of someone who has completely committed to a cause that most people would call monstrous, genuinely good at what he did. When the trap was sprung, when the fleet was becalmed, and the destroyer plague was unleashed, Typhon was the first to stir when the flies came. He was the one who stood when everyone else had fallen. Yet he stood in the fly storm with his arms open and his mind open, and the billions of insects, Nurgle's demonic familiars, manifest pestilence given insect form, did not simply visit him as they had the others. They entered him, they filled him. His body became their hive, his armor a chitinous housing for a colony of supernatural disease, his very existence repurposed into a walking, thinking incubator for the destroyer plague. He became Typhus. His armor, already heavy cataphractii pattern Terminator plate, fused with the biological additions the plague made to him. Funnel-like structures grew from his back, constantly venting clouds of spores and disease-laden gas. His scythe, the man-reaper, Lacrimae, became infused with the essence of the plagues within him, its blade sheathed in an energy field that disrupts molecular bonds. And every wound it inflicts carries Nurgle's own pestilence into the victim's bloodstream with perfect, terrible efficiency. He carries an alchem pistol. He commands the psychic winds of corruption. He is, by any technical military assessment, among the most dangerous individuals in the galaxy. But what makes Typhus truly significant in the history of the zombie plague is not his personal power. It is his relationship with the curse of unbelief specifically. While Mortarians settled into the plague planet and became something more like a stationary power, a demon Primarch managing his legion and his wars from the deep interior of the Eye of Terror, Typhus became the traveler. He has never stopped moving. From the moment of his transformation, he has been on a continuous voyage through the galaxy, and carrying the destroyer hive from one world to the next, unleashing Nurgle's gifts wherever the opportunity presents itself, and always, bringing the zombie plague with him. The zombie plague is Typhus's favorite instrument, not the only one in his repertoire by any means. He has visited dozens of distinct plagues upon the Imperium over 10 millennia, but the one most closely associated with his presence. Where Typhus travels, plague zombies rise. It is almost as reliable as a natural law. His flagship, the Terminus Est, is itself a weapon in this campaign, a warship so thoroughly saturated with the energies of Nurgle that its very presence in a system seems to accelerate the spread of disease, as if the ship itself is exhaling contagion into the space around it. The Terminus Est is ancient. It was old before the Horus Heresy, and 10,000 years of dedicated Nurgle worship have not improved its structural integrity in any conventional sense, but have made it something more than a warship. Its corridors breathe. Its systems are maintained by processes that an Adeptus Mechanicus tech priest would find simultaneously fascinating and profoundly disturbing. Its figurehead, ancient and weather-pitted, looms through the void above worlds that are about to discover what it means to have Typhus for a neighbor. In the millennia since the heresy, Typhus's campaign has been relentless and comprehensively documented in the Imperium's most classified archives. On Legeta, yet he was responsible for a plague song so infectious that those who contracted it were compelled to chant a specific hymn to Nurgle continuously until they wasted away. The sound of 1 million people singing the same song on their way to death, reported by Imperial Guard units from 2 systems away. He turned the entire populations of Protheus and Carandinis, 7, into plague bearers, converting billions of souls into new demons for Nurgle's legion in operations that the Ordo Sepulturum still uses as case studies in why early intervention is non-negotiable. He laid waste to the shrine world of Annunciation alone, the specifics of what he did there deemed classified at the highest inquisitorial levels. On Florins, he released the red flux and erased the entire male population of the planet, not through combat, through disease. In a matter of weeks, and in 757 of the 40th millennium, on a world called Hydra Minoris, Typhus introduced the zombie plague to the official historical record for the first time in the current age of the Imperium. Part 5. The nature of the curse of unbelief. How it works. To understand why the zombie plague is so effective, you need to understand what it actually is. Not just what it does, but what it is at a fundamental level. Because here is the thing that makes it categorically different from any ordinary biological threat. The zombie plague is not primarily a biological threat. It is a spiritual one. The zombie plague is a supernatural, warp-based disease. The biological component is real. It is a necrotic microorganism, something that under a magi-biologist microscope would look like a genuine pathogen, and something with physical size and shape and transmission vectors that behave at least partially according to the rules of biology. But those physical properties are a vessel, a carrier, a delivery mechanism for something that does not follow the rules of biology at all. The active ingredient, if you want to think of it that way, is warp energy. The chaos energy embedded within the virus is what gives the plague its truly unique properties. It is what causes the dead to reanimate. It is what creates the psychic network that links infected individuals. It is what allows the virus to transmit in ways that defy conventional medical understanding. And most importantly, it is what creates the plague's most famous characteristic, its selectivity. The zombie plague cannot infect everyone. This sounds like good news until you understand what it means. The disease does not prey on the physically weak. It is not more dangerous to the immunocompromised or the elderly. It does not care about your physical health at all, in any significant sense. What it cares about is the state of your soul. The zombie plague can only infect those mortals consumed by despair, those who have no hope or faith in their hearts. The curse of unbelief. The name is not poetic license. It is a literal description of the mechanism of infection. The disease finds the gaps in your spiritual armor, the cracks where doubt has entered, where exhaustion has replaced conviction, where the grinding cruelty of life in the 41st millennium has worn away the certainty that there is something worth fighting for, and it fills those gaps with itself. And this is why it spreads most efficiently in places where imperial life has been hardest. In underhives, where generations have grown up in conditions no one could maintain genuine hope within. In besieged cities, where defenders have watched everything they loved destroyed while they waited for relief that came too late or not at all. In populations subjected to prolonged chaos corruption, where the spiritual toxins of the warp have been seeping into the collective psyche of a community for years, wearing down the capacity for faith the way water wears down stone. The ecclesiarchy's official position, which is also functionally accurate in a theological sense, is that the plague afflicts only those lacking pure faith in the emperor. The priests and preachers who maintain this position are not wrong. They are simply describing the same mechanism in different language.
Okay, quick personal thought before we go further. What genuinely gets me about the zombie plague, and I've sat with a lot of 40k lore at this point, is that it's not the gore that makes it disturbing. It's not the rotting skin or the shambling walk or any of the surface level horror stuff. What actually unsettles me is the selectivity. The idea that despair is a literal biological vulnerability. That the grinding hopelessness of life in the hive, something that millions of real people in the real world would recognize a version of, is exactly the crack that something ancient and malevolent has been specifically engineered to exploit. Games Workshop could have just made zombie space disease. You get bit, you turn, classic stuff. But instead, they made a disease that finds you when you're already struggling. that waits for the moment your faith breaks. There's something genuinely thoughtful in that design, even if the thing it's thoughtful about is deeply grim. And honestly, that's why I love this setting. It doesn't just let the horror be simple. It makes you think about why people are vulnerable, not just how. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
A person of absolutely pure, unwavering, unshakable faith in the Emperor, a genuine saint, in the technical sense that the Imperium uses that word, would potentially be immune to the curse of unbelief. Their spiritual defenses would be complete. There would be no crack for the plague to enter through. The problem is that saints are rare, and in the uncaring grind of imperial life in the 41st millennium, the vast majority of the populace, even those who genuinely believe, even those who pray faithfully every night and wear their aquillas and attend the ceremonies of the ministorum, carries some degree of doubt. Some small, human, our entirely understandable measure of wondering whether the golden light of the Emperor actually extends to people in circumstances as grim as theirs. That is enough. Even a hairline crack is enough. The progression of infection follows a recognizable pattern that inquisitors of the Ordo Sepulturum have documented extensively. Initial infection is almost undetectable. The victim may notice a slight malaise, a heaviness in the limbs, a persistent low-grade discomfort that doesn't quite qualify as pain. They may feel slightly warmer than usual or notice a subtle grayness at the edges of their skin. These symptoms are easy to dismiss, easy to attribute to overwork, to stress, to the ordinary physical suffering that life in the hive demands as baseline tribute. Then the progression accelerates. The skin begins to change in texture. It's not dramatically at first. A slight coarsening, a loss of elasticity, a faint discoloration that moves through grey toward the blue-green of deep bruising. The victim begins to feel very cold, then alternately hot, the body's temperature regulation failing as the necrotic process begins its work on the deeper tissues. The internal organs start to decompose from the inside, causing a pressure and heaviness in the torso that is difficult to describe and impossible to ignore. The victim coughs. Sometimes they vomit. Sometimes, in the later stages, they vomit things that were not there before the infection. Death, when it comes, is both a mercy and a transition, because this is where the zombie plague diverges from any other fatal disease in the history of medicine. Death is not the end. What the warp energy embedded in the virus allows a small portion of the victim's life essence, their animus, their soul fragment, whatever philosophical framework you prefer for the thing that makes a person, to be retained by the body even after physical death has occurred. Not enough to sustain consciousness in any meaningful sense, not enough to let the victim speak, or think, or feel, or remember, but enough to keep the nervous system minimally functional, enough to activate the most primitive drives, hunger, motion towards stimuli, the compulsion to bite. The body gets back up. Its movements are the movements of the newly dead, stiff, uncoordinated, driven by impulse rather than intention. The gait is the shambling gait that has become iconic in descriptions of the plague, a dragging, a lurching walk that somehow manages to be simultaneously slow and inexorable. The face settles into whatever expression it wore at the moment of death, frozen there by the loss of voluntary muscle control. Sometimes that expression is of pain. Sometimes it is of fear. Sometimes it is simply blank. And that blankness is perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. The hunger that drives them is transmitted via saliva and blood. A single bite is sufficient. A scratch from infected fingernails can carry enough of the viral load to begin the process in a new host. The plague does not require any particular delivery mechanism beyond contact with the infected material. No insect vector, no airborne transmission under normal conditions, just the simple, terrible intimacy of being touched by something that used to be a person. What makes this so effective as a weapon, as opposed to merely a disaster, is the mathematics of it. A single zombie biting one person creates 2 vectors of infection. Those 2 create 4. Those 4 create 8. In an environment where the infected cannot be destroyed by anything less than complete physical incapacitation, the head must be destroyed, or the body reduced to pieces small enough that the remaining animate tissue cannot function, and where they cannot be contained by walls or doors or conventional quarantine procedures because they feel neither pain nor fear and will literally walk through any obstacle that does not stop them outright. The mathematics of infection become the mathematics of apocalypse with alarming speed. The Ordo Sepulturum has documented the timeline from first confirmed case to total societal collapse on multiple worlds. Under optimal conditions, for the plague, not for the population, an entire hive city of several 100 million people can progress from first case to complete zombie apocalypse in under 30 standard days. The hive functions like an accelerant. The density of population means that transmission is constant. The enclosed environment means that escape is limited. The already strained spiritual state of a typical hive population means that the vast majority of those exposed to the virus are already vulnerable to infection. There is also the psychic dimension to consider. The zombie victims of the plague are not entirely isolated from each other. Whilst the warp energy in the virus creates a subtle psychic connection between all infected individuals, a kind of distributed consciousness that is not quite a hive mind, not quite individual, but something in between. Inquisitors who have studied this connection describe it as resembling a very faint radio signal, present in the background noise of the warp, linking every zombie to every other zombie in a given area and to the broader network of plague victims across infected regions. This is why zombie hordes move in ways that are more coordinated than their individual cognitive state would suggest. A single plague zombie is not particularly dangerous on its own. It is slow, it is clumsy, it is driven by impulse rather than strategy. But 100 plague zombies moving toward a barricaded room seem to find the weak points in the barricade. They seem to distribute themselves around its perimeter with an efficiency no individual among them could achieve. 1,000 plague zombies attacking a defended position seem to know where the defenders are concentrated and which approaches are undefended. None of this is intelligent. The horde does not plan. But the psychic network allows information to flow between the infected in ways that produce behaviors resembling coordination without anything that could be called thought. And the psychers. In the 40K universe, individuals with psychic sensitivity can interact with the zombie plague network in remarkable and deeply disturbing ways. A sufficiently powerful psyker who has been exposed to the plague and who has survived the exposure, which is itself not guaranteed, can potentially tune into the network and use it to direct the behavior of infected individuals. Not through any mechanism that could be called mind control, exactly. More like pressing your hand against a current and redirecting its flow. The zombies cannot be made to perform complex tasks. They cannot be made to speak or reason or act independently, but they can be pointed, the way you might point a fire hose. This capacity for manipulation has been exploited over the history of the plague by a number of individuals, both in organized chaos operations and by independent actors who stumbled into an understanding of how the network works. None more famously than a figure in the underhives of Necromunda named Carloth Valois, whose story we will come to in time. Part 6. Plague Zombies, the Walking Dead of the 41st Millennium. There is a quote, and it appears on official Imperial records from the Siege of Terror, predating the zombie plague as we know it today, because the undead have existed in various forms since before the concept of the Imperium. A conversation between two captains of what would become the Sons of Horus. Captain Tarek Torgadon and Captain Garviel Loken, fighting on the feral moon of Davin, dealing with something that should not have been moving. Torgadon says he has killed 100 of them. Loken responds, "You probably keep killing the same one. If you don't destroy the head, they get back up again." That exchange, preserved in historical records and quoted in inquisitorial briefings to this day, captures something essential about what plague zombies are and why they are so persistently terrible. They are not subtle. They are not sophisticated. They do not deploy clever tactics or use advanced weapons or adapt to changing battlefield conditions with any particular intelligence. They are, on their face, exactly what they appear to be: shambling, decaying, empty-eyed remnants of humanity, driven by the simplest possible motivation, and armed with nothing more sophisticated than their teeth and their hands. But they get back up. That's the thing. That's always the thing. You can shoot them. You can stab them. You can knock them down with the butt of your rifle, or the edge of your blade, or the impact of a thrown piece of rubble. And unless you destroy the head, unless you prevent the remaining fragments of warp-sustained neural activity from continuing to animate the body, they get back up, and they come back for you. In military terms, this creates a tactical problem that is qualitatively different from most combat scenarios. Standard infantry doctrine assumes that damage degrades enemy effectiveness. A soldier who has taken a serious wound is a reduced threat compared to an undamaged one. The mathematics of attrition warfare depend on this assumption being true. Against plague zombies, this assumption does not hold. A zombie missing an arm is functionally as dangerous as an intact one. A zombie with multiple gunshot wounds in the torso is functionally as dangerous as one that hasn't been touched. Well, the only things that actually reduce their effectiveness are physical destruction of the central nervous system or complete dismemberment, reducing the body to pieces small enough that independent locomotion becomes impossible. For an Imperial guardsman armed with a laser gun, dealing reliably headshots to dozens of shambling targets in a dark, crowded corridor, while simultaneously trying to avoid being grabbed by any of them, is significantly harder than the phrasing suggests. For the same guardsman trying to do this while also managing the psychological reality of what they are fighting, which used to be people, which still looks exactly like people, which may include people they knew, the difficulty escalates considerably. The Imperium has developed doctrine for fighting plague zombies, all refined over thousands of years of dealing with outbreaks. Fire is the first answer. Fire is almost always the first answer for any Nurgle-related problem, and there is good reason for this. Flamethrowers, incendiary grenades, promethium poured down corridors and ignited. These eliminate the problem of bodies that keep moving, while also serving the secondary function of destroying potential sources of fresh infection. The Adeptus Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, have elevated the deployment of cleansing flame to a spiritual practice, and they are, statistically, among the most effective forces in the Imperium for dealing with zombie outbreaks, partly because of their weapons, and partly because of their unshakable faith, which makes them resistant to the despair that would otherwise make them vulnerable to the plague's spiritual component. The Astra Militarum has protocol that sound extreme until you understand the context. All deceased must be burned within 6 minutes of death to prevent reanimation. This 6-minute window represents the Ordo Sepulturum's estimate of how long it takes the virus to establish sufficient warp energy bridges in a newly dead body to enable reanimation. Burn them before that window closes, and the threat is eliminated at source. This protocol has saved untold millions of lives across hundreds of documented outbreak scenarios. It has also been violated with tragic frequency by grieving families who cannot bring themselves to burn their dead, by soldiers who cannot stop to deal with their fallen comrades in the heat of battle, by overwhelmed medical personnel who run out of flammable materials or whose incinerators are already burning at capacity, by individuals whose faith, even in the protocol itself, even in the empirical evidence of what happens when you don't follow it, has been eroded by exhaustion and grief to the point where they simply cannot do the thing they know they should. The plague exploits all of these moments. Plague zombies are used tactically by the Death Guard and their servants in ways that reveal a grim understanding of human psychology and military logistics. Typhus does not typically deploy zombie hordes as his primary offensive weapon. They are not the spearhead of his assaults, not the shock troops he sends in first. They are the second and third waves. They are the forces that arrive after the initial attack has created conditions, chaos, panic, casualties, the breakdown of organized defense, in which zombie hordes become maximally effective. More usefully still, zombie hordes function as attrition weapons against defenders with limited ammunition and energy resources. A company of Imperial guardsmen in a fortified position can hold against a zombie horde for a considerable time if they have sufficient ammunition. They will run out of ammunition before they run out of targets. The horde does not run out of anything. It does not eat its rations. It does not tire. It does not feel fear or doubt or the crushing psychological weight of watching the people next to you die. It just keeps coming. And the whole time it keeps coming, every person killed by the horde becomes a new recruit. And every body that falls before the ammunition runs out, and the ammunition will run out, is a potential addition to the attacking force. The mathematics that work against the defenders in the attrition calculations work in the plague's favor, because the plague's side of the ledger keeps growing while the defender's side only shrinks. There are documented instances of planetary defenders holding for weeks, months, against overwhelming zombie hordes, maintaining fortified positions through sheer discipline, firepower, and the kind of faith that actually does provide some protection against the plague's spiritual component. These are the success stories, the ones that get remembered and taught as examples of humanity's capacity for endurance. The ones that don't get taught are the ones where the ammunition ran out on day 43, or the water supply was contaminated on day 11, or the commanding officer's faith broke on day 27 and he opened a door he should have kept closed. Those are more numerous. Plague zombies have appeared in conflicts documented as far back as reliable imperial records extend. The Battle of Davin's Moon, fought during the events leading to the Horus Heresy, features the earliest clearly described encounter in accessible records, which is itself significant, because it suggests that the plague's history predates even typhus's transformation. The zombie plague in some form, possibly an earlier and less refined version, was circulating in the galaxy before the heresy made it a weapon of mass destruction. On the world of Necromunda, as whose underhives have been described by inquisitors as among the most spiritually compromised environments in the Segmentum Obscurus, a hive city so large and so old that its depths have not seen genuine sunlight in centuries, and its population in the deep levels has been living in conditions of sustained hopelessness for so many generations that the despair has become structural, part of the architecture of the place. The zombie plague is listed as a persistent background threat, not a periodic crisis that arrives and must be dealt with. A constant, something that is always present in the deepest levels, always spreading at a low simmer, always ready to flare into a significant outbreak when conditions shift the wrong way. The ecclesiastical position that the plague afflicts only the unfaithful has created a secondary social problem in plague zones that military planners had not initially anticipated. When a zombie outbreak occurs in a community, survivors who witness it happening sometimes conclude, incorrectly but understandably, that the people who became infected were spiritually defective, that they deserved it somehow, that their lack of faith was a failing that justified what happened to them. This is theologically incorrect even within the Imperium's own framework, but it is a seductive conclusion for people desperately seeking a narrative that puts some distance between themselves and the possibility of the same fate. This conclusion is dangerous. It delays evacuation, delays quarantine implementation, and delays the reporting of new cases as survivors refuse to admit that someone they love might have been infected because they do not want to accept that implication about that person's faith. It creates exactly the kind of delay that allows localized outbreaks to become regional disasters. The Inquisition is aware of this dynamic. It has not yet identified a way to address it that is both accurate and useful within the Imperium's existing theological framework. Part 7. Hydra Minoris and the Great Campaigns. The official history of the zombie plague in the current age of the Imperium begins with a single world, Hydra Minoris. The year is 757 of the 40th Millennium, 2.5 centuries before the current era, though in the timescale of a 10,000-year war, that is not so long ago. What happened on Hydra Minoris is not fully documented in publicly accessible imperial records. What the Ordo Sepulturum's classified archives contain is more detailed, but still incomplete, because by the time the Inquisition was able to send investigators, the situation had progressed to a point where obtaining reliable testimony from survivors was challenging. What is known is this: Typhus led his death guard into the heart of Hydra Minoris's capital hive, delivered the zombie plague into the population at its most concentrated point, and withdrew. The Imperial Navy, when it became clear what was happening, imposed a quarantine. 23 billion uninfected people, trapped on the same world as a rising tide of hungry, infectious undead, sealed in by a cordon of warships, with orders to prevent any vessel from leaving the system. 23 billion people. The quarantine held. That is the Imperial Navy's greatest achievement on Hydra Minoris, and the cost of maintaining it. The human cost, the psychological cost, the cost measured in individual lives of people who died within that quarantine perimeter, while ships watched from orbit that could have taken them to safety but could not risk carrying the infection, is never spoken of in the official record. The official record says the quarantine held. The classified record says that 17 Navy officers were removed from command during the operation for attempted breaches of the cordon. The very classified record says what happened to them afterward. Hydra Minoris was a demonstration. That is the only interpretation that makes sense given the subsequent history. Typhus was not trying to conquer Hydra Minoris. He was not seeking resources or territory or any conventional military objective. He was showing the Imperium what the zombie plague could do. He was establishing a reference point, a data point in the Imperium's institutional memory, so that when the plague appeared elsewhere, the fear would already be there, already calibrated to the correct magnitude of threat. The subsequent 2+ centuries saw the zombie plague appearing with increasing frequency across the worlds of the Segmentum Obscurus, always near the Eye of Terror, always in the wake of movements by the Death Guard. Each outbreak added to the Inquisition's understanding of the plague's mechanics and added to the institutional fear of it. The Ordo Sepulturum was formed in the years leading up to the 13th Black Crusade, specifically because the frequency of outbreaks had reached a level where informal coordination between individual inquisitors was no longer sufficient. A dedicated body was needed. The scale of what was coming demanded it. The 13th Black Crusade, the war that would shatter Cadia and crack the galaxy open with the Great Rift. In the annals of the Imperium, it is the worst crisis in 10,000 years. And it began not with a military assault, not with guns and troops and warships, but with plague. The opening move of the 13th Black Crusade was a series of space hulks, those vast, horrifying amalgamations of ships fused together by warp currents and chaos energy, drifting through real space like sick jokes about maritime disaster, emerging from the Eye of Terror into the Cadian sector. Our Imperial forces boarded several of them and found them full of infection, disease-ridden nightmares. The crew, whatever life they had once contained, had been reduced to plague vectors. The boarding parties paid for their investigation in blood and suffering, and the warning came too late. Other hulks slipped through the blockade. They did not need to crash. They did not need to deploy troops. They simply had to arrive in the atmosphere of inhabited worlds, settle into decaying orbits, shed debris, and let the plague do its work. Within days of their arrival, crews of Imperial Navy warships began presenting symptoms. Within weeks, inhabited worlds in the Cadian and Agrippina sectors were reporting cases. Within a month, a dozen worlds were in quarantine, and the Imperial Navy had halted inter-system transit across the entire region. Or that was the point. Military doctrine in the 41st millennium depends on mobility. Forces must be able to reach threatened positions quickly. Supply lines must flow. Reinforcements must be able to respond to breakthroughs. By sealing off large sections of the Segmentum Obscurus with the fear of plague, Abaddon had immobilized the Imperial response before his conventional military forces had even arrived. Then came the Terminus Est. Typhus himself arrived in the Agrippina sector with his plague fleet, 40 years of planning and several centuries of accumulated expertise deployed in service of the greatest military offensive chaos had mounted since the heresy itself. The worlds that had been weakened by plague, their populations reduced, their military forces stretched thin, trying to contain zombie outbreaks, as their civilian governments, paralyzed by the social chaos that follows widespread death and reanimation, found themselves facing not just the plague, but the Death Guard in force, and the Death Guard were not coming to contain the situation. Bellis Corona fell with particular speed. By the time Typhus's fleet arrived in that system, the plague had already done most of the work. The hive world had been simultaneously dealing with zombie outbreaks across multiple hives, an apocalyptic cult that had arisen in the chaos and was actively obstructing quarantine efforts while preaching that the plague was divine judgment, and the only salvation was submission, and the psychological collapse that accompanies the realization that your world's military and civil infrastructure are no longer capable of protecting you. It was not a battle. It was a completion. On Amistel, the Death Guard walked through battlefields where the defenders' own dead were rising against them, where every soldier who fell became an obstacle his comrades had to fight through before they could reach the next enemy. The mathematical calculus of that scenario, fighting a living enemy while also fighting your own fallen, with every casualty increasing the number of things fighting against you, produces a collapse curve that even veteran commanders have described as almost impossible to address through conventional military means. The Agrippina sector, without adequate imperial aid, fell into ruin at Typhus's hands. He turned the world of Ulthor into what was effectively his own personal demon world, as a festering principality in real space outside the Eye of Terror, from which he could continue to project influence and disease into the surrounding systems. The Death Guard had, through the application of plague as a strategic weapon, effectively redrawn the map of that region of the Imperium. Let us dwell here for a moment, because when we talk about worlds falling to the zombie plague, we tend to talk in aggregate numbers, populations, casualties, infection rates, containment failures. We talk in the language of strategic analysis, which is the language of people looking at maps and making decisions about what can be saved and what must be abandoned. It is necessary language. It is the only language in which decisions at that scale can be made and communicated, but it abstracts something that deserves not to be abstracted. It makes statistics out of people. Imagine the hive world of Subiaco Diablo, not the strategic asset, not the population number, the actual place. Dense, overcrowded, millions of people living in close proximity in a hive structure that had been growing for so long that its lower levels had long since ceased to be navigable by anyone who had not grown up in them. A place that had, despite everything, the kind of life that places have when people have been living in them for generations. The specific rhythm of its work shifts, and its market days, and its religious observances, the informal community structures that grew up to fill the gaps in the official infrastructure, and the chapels and meeting halls and the vendors who set up in the same spots every morning, and whose children knew the children of the people who had been buying from their grandparents. The plague arrived there carried by people fleeing from other worlds. The transit bans came too late. They almost always come too late, because the interval between first case and recognized outbreak is precisely the window during which transit continues unrestricted, precisely the window during which the infection spreads most efficiently. By the time the Administratum's Officio Medicae imposed the quarantine, Subiaco Diablo already had millions of cases. By the time the Death Guard arrived in the system, the hive world's own military was fighting its own population and losing. Not because the military was weak, not because the defense was poorly organized, because the plague's mathematics do not care about military competence. They care only about numbers and time. For every soldier who fell in defense of a barricade, there was a calculation that ran automatically. How long before that body was burned? Who was responsible for burning it? Were they still operational? Or had they themselves fallen in the same engagement? Was the incinerator functional, or had it been destroyed in the fight? If the body was not burned in 6 minutes, what was the projected moment of reanimation? And was anyone still positioned to deal with it when it stood back up? At scale, across millions of casualties distributed across a hive city that had effectively become a war zone, these calculations resolved unfavorably with an inevitability that no amount of courage or discipline or faith could entirely prevent. The fallen kept rising, the lines kept shrinking, the ammunition kept running out. When Typhus arrived, Subiaco Diablo was already largely gone. What remained of its defenders were reduced to isolated pockets, small groups of people holding specific buildings, maintaining specific perimeters, burning their dead with desperate efficiency, and waiting for rescue that was not coming because the rescue ships could not make it through the plague fleet. His arrival was not a conquest. It was a completion. The plague had done the work. He simply came to see it finished. The Howling Griffins, Space Marine. Chapter: Fighting across the Agrippina sector during this campaign. A conducted a series of rescue and extraction operations that are now taught in Imperial military academies as models of how Space Marine forces should operate in zombie plague environments, moving in small, tightly disciplined squads with complete biological isolation between units, maintaining absolute burn protocols regardless of the combat situation, never touching the infected with unprotected hands, ever, prioritizing the extraction of command-level personnel and administratum officials over general population evacuation, because maintaining the chain of command in surviving population centers was the only way to prevent the social collapse that the plague needed to spread through the spiritual vulnerability of leaderless, hopeless civilians. The Howling Griffins saved millions. Millions more could not be reached. What the Cadians on their homeworld received a propaganda notice at the start of the 13th Black Crusade that has since become iconic in representations of the conflict. Simple, direct, posted on every public notice board in every hive on the planet, the kind of notice that assumes no prior education and no particular reading level. Attention citizens, beware the zombie plague. All deceased must be burned within 6 minutes of death to prevent reanimation. 6 minutes. 6 minutes between a person and the thing that person becomes if no one burns them in time. 6 minutes is very short when you are kneeling beside someone you love. Cadia fell in the end to Abaddon's forces, but the plague had been the hand that loosened the fist's grip before the blow landed. The Cadian Gate. The great choke point through which the Eye of Terror's forces had always had to pass before reaching the broader Imperium, ceased to function as a gate when Cadia was destroyed. And the destruction of Cadia, the loss of the pylons that had maintained it as an anchor point against warp incursion, opened the Great Rift, after which everything got significantly worse. Part 8. Poxwalkers, the New Evolution. The Great Rift did not simply change the political and military landscape of the 41st millennium. It changed the metaphysical landscape of the galaxy in ways that are still being assessed. When the Cadian Gate broke, and the warp surge that followed cracked real space from one edge of the galaxy to the other, creating the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, et a scar across the sky that separates the northern and southern halves of the Imperium and bathes both in the bleeding light of chaos. The concentration of warp energy in real space increased dramatically and permanently. For Nurgle, this was an opportunity. The zombie plague, already a versatile and effective weapon, began to mutate. Under the increased warp radiation, the existing viral strains of the plague accelerated their evolution, and new strains emerged that had not existed before the rift. The Ordo Sepulturum documented them as they appeared: the Weeping, the Mutterflux, the Slithering Scourge, names that sound almost poetic until you understand what they refer to, what they do, what they create. From this new generation of plague strains emerged something the Imperium had not seen before: the Poxwalker. And the Poxwalkers are related to standard plague zombies in the way that a river is related to a creek. They share a family resemblance, the same warp energy reanimation, the same infectious transmission, the same compulsion toward living flesh, and the same resistance to conventional damage that makes them such persistent threats. but what they are at the level of specific detail is something evolved beyond the original template, mutated into a form that is, by most measures, more dangerous. A cocktail of the new plague strains, primarily the walking pox, which some inquisitors of the Ordo Sepulturum theorize may be a variant of Nurgle's rot itself, produces a victim that goes through the same basic progression of infection and death, but then continues to change after reanimation. But the Poxwalker does not simply reanimate as a slightly degraded version of its former self. It continues to mutate. It continues to develop, in the awful sense of that word, into something that the original plague zombie template would not have produced. The mutations are distinctive. Horn-like bone growths erupt from the skull, pushing through decomposing skin. Additional eyes develop in clusters of 3, opening in places where no eyes should be: the side of the neck, the back of the hand, the sternum. Tentacles emerge from the torso, initially small and vestigial, growing over time as the warp energy within the host continues to modify the biological substrate. These features are recognizable to those familiar with Nurgle's demonic servants. As the plague bearers, the Poxwalker mutations are developmental steps in the same direction as those that produce a fully formed plague bearer demon, which has led to speculation that what you are witnessing in a Poxwalker is the early stages of a process that, given sufficient time and sufficient warp energy, might result in demonic apotheosis. Whether that is true in a meaningful sense remains contested. What is not contested is that these mutations make Poxwalkers harder to identify as former humans, harder to fight, and in some ways, harder to emotionally process for defenders who have not encountered them before. There is a particular psychological horror to something that was human, then became a zombie, and then began growing horns and additional eyes. Because at each stage of that process there is less of the original person visible within it, and more of something alien and wrong. The other critical development of the walking pox strains is the Poxwalker's groan. Standard plague zombies are noisy. They shuffle and moan and make the sounds of decaying bodies moving through space. This noise is unpleasant, but not specifically weaponized beyond its effect on the morale of anyone who has to listen to it for extended periods. The sound of a Poxwalker is different. The mindless, moaning cacophony that escapes their mutated vocal apparatus carries within it a spiritual contagion, a fragment of the walking pox transmitted as sound, infecting the souls of living beings who hear it at close range, if those souls are already compromised by despair or doubt. Hearing the groan of a Poxwalker is not automatically fatal, but it creates a spiritual vulnerability, a brief, intense moment of existential dread that the plague can exploit as a vector. In a group of defenders who are already exhausted, already afraid, already watching their comrades be turned into the things they are fighting, a sufficiently large chorus of Poxwalker groans can tip individual soldiers from maintained but fragile faith into the kind of sudden, sharp despair that the plague requires for immediate infection. This is not merely a psychological attack, it is a direct assault on the spiritual immune system. The Poxwalker also retains more of the original host's rudimentary coordination than a standard plague zombie. They are still not intelligent. They are still driven purely by compulsion. But they display a slightly more functional ability to navigate obstacles, to respond to stimuli in ways that suggest a few more neurons are still connected than the standard zombie template would imply. They can, for instance, be directed more effectively by psychers who understand how to access the plague network. The signal is cleaner, the response more consistent. They also walk faster. Not quickly, by the standards of a living person running. But the stiff-legged shamble of the standard plague zombie, while implacable, gives defenders time to keep their distance. Poxwalkers move at something approaching a normal walking pace, and when their predatory drive triggers, when a living target is close enough to smell or sense, whilst they can achieve short bursts of speed that close the distance before a defender has registered that the situation has changed. The Death Guard love Poxwalkers. The veteran sorcerers and champions of the Legion, the malignant plague casters and the lords of contagion and the noxious blightbringers collect them the way a gardener might collect specimens of an unusually successful hybridization. There is a report, declassified by the Ordo Sepulturum at appropriate security levels, describing a Death Guard lord who maintained a personal collection of poxwalkers composed entirely of the former members of a defeated Astra Militarum regiment, kept not as weapons, but as a trophy of what the curse of unbelief does to those who face the Death Guard and fail. The full details of that report are not something I'll be sharing tonight, but the spirit of it captures something important about how the Death Guard relate to their plague victims. In the current era, since the formation of the Great Rift, poxwalkers have become the dominant form of zombie threat across the central and northern Imperium. The original standard plague zombie still appears in regions where Death Guard activity has been lower, and the concentration of new warp-mutated strains is less pervasive. The outer reaches of the Segmentum Pacificus, the more isolated systems of the Segmentum Ultima. But wherever the Death Guard have been active, wherever the Weeping or the Mutterflux have circulated, the poxwalker form predominates. The Ordo Sepulturum has updated its field protocols accordingly, though the core advice remains unchanged. Destroy the head, burn the body, burn it now, do not wait, and do not grieve, do not hesitate. The Warhammer 40,000 video game Darktide takes place in Hive Tertium on the world of Atoma Prime, deep in the Moebian domain, where a Nurglish cult called the Admonition unleashed the walking pox on the Hive's population. The resulting poxwalker infestation required inquisitorial intervention, and the game serves as an excellent illustration of what dealing with a large-scale poxwalker outbreak actually looks like at the ground level. The chaos of a hive in the process of consuming itself, the transformation of civilian infrastructure into hostile territory, the specific texture of a world in the process of losing its battle with Grandfather Nurgle's gift. On Atoma Prime is even canids, the domesticated dogs, and similar creatures kept by many hive residents as working animals or companions, were not immune to the walking pox. Infected animals become what the Ordo Sepulturum's documentation calls pox hounds, dead-eyed, rotting, still possessed of their pack instincts and their speed, but stripped of everything else that made them what they were. The image of a once loyal pet returning as a plague vector for its former owner captures something uniquely horrible about the curse of unbelief that the more abstract scale of billion-person casualties does not. The intimate losses are the ones that break people, and broken people are exactly what the plague needs. Part 9. The Ordo Sepulturum. Humanity fights back. The Imperium of Man is, among its many attributes, an institution that has survived 10,000 years of existential threats by developing, eventually, the specific bureaucratic infrastructure that each threat demands. Sometimes it develops that infrastructure too late. Sometimes the cost of developing it is measured in worlds lost and billions dead. But the machinery of the Imperium is ancient and adaptable, and when a threat reaches sufficient magnitude, the response eventually comes. The zombie plague reached sufficient magnitude in the years before the 13th Black Crusade. The Ordo Sepulturum, the word sepulturum deriving from the old language, meaning something close to burial or entombment, is one of the smaller and newer of the Inquisition's Ordos Minoris. Unlike the great Ordos Majoris, which have existed in various forms since the earliest days of the Imperium, but the Ordo Sepulturum was essentially created on the fly, assembled from existing inquisitors who had been independently tracking the rising frequency of zombie plague outbreaks and communicating with each other about what they were seeing. The specific chain of events that led to its formal establishment centered on a Thorian inquisitor named Agastri. Agastri was part of the Thorian philosophical faction within the Inquisition, a school of thought preoccupied with questions of the Emperor's nature and the possibility of divine rebirth or reincarnation, the kind of theological speculation that more conservative elements of the Inquisition find uncomfortable but have never quite managed to formally suppress. Thorians study spiritual matters with unusual rigor. and Agastri's attention had been drawn to the zombie plague specifically because of something that distinguishes it from other Nurgle diseases. The plague preserves something of the victim after death. In inquisitorial theological terms, this is extraordinary. The conventional understanding of the soul in the 40,000 universe is that it departs the body at death and is either absorbed into the Imperium in ways that depend on the strength and nature of the individual's spiritual imprint, or it joins the vast psychic gestalt that surrounds and sustains the Emperor on his golden throne. Either way, death is, spiritually, a one-way transition. The soul leaves. The body is empty. The zombie plague does not work this way. The chaos energy embedded in the virus retains some fragment of the victim, not enough to maintain consciousness, thus not enough for anything that could meaningfully be called personhood, but enough that the spiritual question becomes interesting. What is retained? What is the minimum quantum of soul that a physical body can contain and still be considered to retain some connection to its former occupant? And if that minimum can be identified and isolated, what does it tell you about how the Emperor sustains himself on the Golden Throne? This connection between the operation of the zombie plague and the operation of the Golden Throne is one of the most sensitive and tightly classified areas of inquisitorial research. The Thorians believe, and there is genuine philosophical evidence for this position, yet that the Golden Throne uses warp energy to maintain the Emperor's body in a state that is functionally analogous to what the zombie plague does to its victims, holding the body in a state between life and death through the continuous application of directed psychic power. If this is correct, the zombie plague might represent a corrupted version of the same underlying technology or the same underlying spiritual principle that keeps the Emperor alive. Some go further. They suggest that the zombie plague might, in its undistorted form, provide clues to the possibility of the Emperor's rebirth. That if you could strip away the chaos corruption, if you could understand the mechanism by which a minimal soul fragment sustains a body after death, you might be able to construct a faith virus, a version of this technology oriented toward light rather than rot, toward renewal rather than decay, toward the Emperor's eventual return rather than Nurgle's endless expansion. All experiments along these lines have so far resulted in mutation of the sample into something clearly chaotic. The corrupted form of the technology is stable. The uncorrupted form, if it exists, has not yet been achieved. The Ordo Sepulturum's practical mandate, leaving aside the theological speculation, is direct: investigate, contain, and eliminate zombie plague outbreaks. This sounds simpler than it is. Investigation requires getting close to active outbreak zones, which means operating in environments where every corpse is a potential threat and every living person is a potential vector. That containment involves making decisions that are always terrible and sometimes must be made quickly. At what point does a zone need to be isolated rather than evacuated? At what point has the mathematical curve of infection progressed so far that no recovery is possible, and the only rational response is exterminatus? The Ordo Sepulturum has issued exterminatus orders more often than any of the other Ordos Minoris, not because its inquisitors are more willing to sacrifice humanity, because the specific threat they face grows exponentially and faster than any other category of threat the Inquisition deals with. When the calculus tips, it tips quickly, and waiting too long to make the final call costs more lives than the call itself. Inquisitor Bastian Caius was one of the notable figures of the early Ordo. He participated in the reclamation of Cathar in 999 of the 41st Millennium, an operation to retake a world that had been fully infected with zombie plague. The reclamation of Cathar is documented as a model of how to conduct such an operation: systematic, disciplined, with carefully designed quarantine zones and fire teams that moved section by section through the hive while maintaining absolute protocols about what happened to any soldier who took a wound from an infected creature. Inquisitor Caius died during that reclamation, killed by the demon prince of Nurgle, who had been responsible for the initial outbreak. The operational documentation he left behind became foundational to the Ordo's procedure manual. The Ordo Sepulturum operates primarily around the Eye of Terror and the Great Rift, the regions where Death Guard activity is highest and zombie outbreaks are most frequent. It is small, it is specialized. By inquisitorial standards, it is young, but it has accumulated, over the decades since its formation, an expertise and a ruthlessness specific to its mandate that makes it among the most effective organizations in the Imperium for dealing with the one thing it exists to deal with. Its members tend to be individuals who have achieved a particular kind of peace with horror. Not desensitization exactly. The most effective inquisitors of the Ordo Sepulturum are, almost universally, people who continue to feel the weight of every decision, who do not allow themselves to become numb, but a clarity about priorities that makes the terrible decisions possible without destroying the person who makes them. You do not last long in the Ordo if you cannot stand in a street full of the walking dead and make precise, accurate assessments about what must be done, and then do those things without hesitation. What you must never do in the Ordo's doctrine is lose faith, because the faith of the Inquisitor is both their greatest operational asset and their most fundamental protection against becoming a victim of the very plague they fight. Part 10. Carloth Valois and the Underhive. To understand the full range of what the zombie plague can do, you need to look beyond the scale of planetary invasion and macro-strategic catastrophe and into the intimate, personal, and deeply strange stories that the plague generates at the individual level. And there is no better entry point for that than the story of Carloth Valois, possibly the most unusual figure in the entire documented history of the Curse of Unbelief. Necromunda is a hive world, which means it is a planet whose surface is mostly given over to the superstructures of enormous industrial cities called hive cities. Each hive city is a self-contained civilization, a vertical world that begins at the bottom with the underhive, the deep, ancient, lightless levels where the original city's infrastructure has been buried under centuries of new construction, where the poorest and most marginal elements of the hive's population live in conditions that would appall even by imperial standards, and rises through the middle hive of workers and manufactoria to the upper spire where the wealthy and powerful live in relative comfort. The underhive of Hive Primus, on Necromunda, is, by the assessment of imperial authorities and the testimony of anyone who has survived extended time in it, among the most unpleasant places in the Segmentum Obscurus. The air systems broke down generations ago. The water supply has been contaminated with industrial waste products since before anyone alive can remember. The social structure is a web of gang politics and violence that exists entirely outside the formal governance structures of the hive above. The religious landscape has fragmented into dozens of competing cult movements, some aligned with the ecclesiarchy, many not, all of them feeding on the fear and desperation of a population that has no other comfort available to them. The curse of unbelief is, the records note, rife in the underhives of the sprawling hive world Necromunda. It is not merely present, it is structural. Into this environment came a young man named Carloth Valois, who was not there by choice. He had been living in the better parts of the hive city, hiding a secret that in the Imperium of man is about as dangerous a secret as you can have. He was a psyker, not an officially registered, Inquisition-monitored, properly trained psyker in sanctioned service. A wild psyker, uncontrolled, his abilities emerging without guidance or framework, or bombarding him with the thoughts and feelings of everyone around him in an unfiltered torrent that had no volume control. He had precognitive flashes that manifested as nightmares he couldn't distinguish from reality. He felt the emotional weight of strangers as if it was his own. He had fled to the underhive to get away from people, and the underhive, being what it was, nearly killed him repeatedly in the ordinary ways the underhive kills people. And then one day, alone and weakened in the deepest levels of the hive bottom, he was found by something worse than the gangers and the chemical hazards. He was found by plague zombies. They chased him through corridors so old they were no longer in any map of the hive, through tunnels that had been sealed for a century and reopened only because the walls had rotted through. Then they chased him until his legs gave out, until he fell in the dark, and as the zombies reached him and began to do what zombies do, something in him, in extremis, reached out with his psychic abilities in a completely new direction. He felt their minds, what was left of them, the fragments of consciousness that the plague had retained, the warp energy residue that gave even the shambling dead a kind of minimal neural activity. He felt them not as people, but as currents. And in desperation, in the last seconds before death, he pressed against those currents and redirected them. They stopped. They backed away. He lay in the dark, bitten, infected, dying by any conventional reckoning. And the plague took him. But it took him differently than it takes most people. His psychic gifts, already unusual, he interacted with the warp energy of the plague in a way that had not been documented before. The plague, which should have killed him and left his body as another mindless, shambling corpse, instead modified his abilities. Rather than destroying his higher functions, it wove itself through them, creating a hybrid between psyker and plague victim that should not be possible. He retained his consciousness, his identity, his capacity for thought and planning. He retained his psychic abilities, and he gained something new. He could feed on the life energy of living creatures, siphoning it into himself to sustain the processes that the plague was simultaneously destroying. This made him effectively immortal as long as prey was available, a deeply troubling prospect in an environment like the Underhive, where prey was somewhat available. And he could control plague zombies, not merely redirect their movements in an emergency, but actively command them, adjust their behavior, send them where he wished them to go, and have them perform simple tasks. He became, in the vocabulary of the Underhive, the zombie master. His story from that point has the quality of a dark legend, told in whispers in the hive bars of Necromunda. He wandered the deep levels, trading protection and zombie labor for supplies and accommodation, becoming a figure that gangs approached for uneasy alliances when their tactical situation was desperate enough to justify the association. His reputation grew. His control over the zombies grew as he studied the plague within himself and the network it had established between him and the undead. He preyed on the living where he could, because he had to. Because the alternative was to stop feeding and let the plague take what was left of him. This was not something he could justify to anyone, including himself, as anything other than what it was. He was a predator, he knew it. The Underhive's various factions knew it. The redemptionist cult, the fire and brimstone Puritan religious movement that periodically swept the hive's lower levels on crusades of enthusiastic incineration, hunted him with the specific intensity of people who believe very strongly that some things simply must be burned. He survived multiple reported deaths. The redemptionists claim to have killed him at least twice. The records are inconsistent on this point, which is itself consistent with what is known about how the plague functions in Karloth's unusual case. Whether he could survive actual death is unclear. Well, what is clear is that he was extremely difficult to kill in the conventional sense. His story represents something important about the zombie plague, the possibility of interface. Most encounters with plague zombies are encounters with a monolithic, mindless mass, a force of nature in human form, no more negotiable than a flood or a fire. Karloth Valois demonstrated that the network underlying that mass had structure that could be accessed and, under the right circumstances, directed. He was not the only documented case. The Ordo Sepulturum maintains a file on psychers who have survived plague exposure and developed similar, if generally lesser, abilities to interact with zombie hordes. But he was the most capable and the most documented. He also demonstrated something about the nature of the plague's spiritual selectivity that complicates the simple picture of infection equals despair. Karloth Valois was a man of no particular faith in the Emperor. His life had not left much room for faith in anything beyond his own survival. By the criteria that the ecclesiarchy uses to define vulnerability to the curse of unbelief, he should have been as vulnerable as anyone. The plague did infect him. It killed him, in the technical sense. What it did not do was extinguish him. His survival was not a function of his faith. It was a function of something in his psychic makeup that interacted with the warp energy of the plague in a way that prevented the extinction of his higher consciousness. And this is one of the reasons the Ordo Sepulturum maintains files on psychically sensitive individuals in plague zones, not because they are planning to use them as weapons, though that possibility exists, but because understanding the cases where the plague does not work as expected is how you develop countermeasures and treatment protocols for the cases where it does. The story of Carloth Valois haunts the edges of Necromunda's history like a ghost, officially dead, periodically rumored, occasionally cited, always hunted. If he is still alive, he is among the oldest sustained victims of the zombie plague in recorded history. What he has become over the decades since his infection, what his relationship with the plague has evolved into, what the combination of his surviving psyker abilities and his deep intimacy with the network of undead have produced in him, these are questions the Ordo Sepulturum would very much like to have answers to. Part 11. The Great Rift and the Future of the Curse. We arrive, finally, at the present. The Great Rift changed everything. In the years before it tore open, the zombie plague was a significant and persistent threat concentrated primarily in the regions near the Eye of Terror. Dangerous, capable of planetary devastation, requiring a dedicated inquisitorial organization to manage, but contained, in the broad sense, to specific geographic and metaphysical regions where the conditions for its spread were most favorable. The Great Rift removed those geographic boundaries. When the Cicatrix Maledictum split the galaxy from the Nachmund Gauntlet to the eastern fringe, it did not merely create a physical barrier, it flooded real space with concentrated warp energy across an enormous area that included regions that had never before experienced direct warp incursion on this scale. Worlds in the Ultima Segmentum, in the Segmentum Pacificus, in regions so far from the Eye of Terror that they had existed as relatively stable imperial territory for millennia. All of these were suddenly saturated with the raw energy of the Imperium in ways that had profound effects on local psychic phenomena, on demon activity, and on the evolution of plague strains. For the zombie plague specifically, this meant mutation, was the strains that had been circulating near the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years encountered new conditions, new populations, new biological and spiritual baselines in the populations of worlds that had not previously been exposed to Nurgle's touch. Under these conditions, with the increased warp radiation providing the energy for accelerated evolution, new strains emerged with new capabilities. The walking pox variants, the strains that produce poxwalkers rather than standard plague zombies, are the most significant of these new developments, but they are not the only ones. The Ordo Sepulturum's catalogue of documented zombie plague variants has grown dramatically since the formation of the Great Rift, and several of the new strains are remarkable for their novel transmission vectors. The Doubtworm, documented in inquisitorial records, spreads not through biological contact but through the mind. It is a spiritual contagion first and a physical one second. The infection beginning as a specific kind of existential doubt, a particularly sharp crisis of faith that the plague has learned to use as a primary transmission mechanism rather than a secondary vulnerability. A victim of the Doubtworm begins by experiencing what appears to be a religious crisis, ordinary despair, but with specific content, specific questions, a specific texture to the loss of faith that the Ordo Sepulturum has learned to recognize as a signature of the strain. By the time the physical symptoms manifest, by the time the bodies begin to rise, the spiritual infection has already spread through every person who witnessed the initial victim's anguish. The implications of this are significant. Standard containment protocols for zombie plague depend on the ability to identify infected individuals before death by observing physical symptoms. A strain that spreads through shared emotional experience before any physical symptoms are visible challenges those protocols at a fundamental level. How do you quarantine a crisis of faith? Other strains of the post-Rift period have developed infection vectors that the Ordo Sepulturum describes in its documentation as nightmares, groans of misery, and the surrender to despair. These are not metaphors. These are literal transmission routes. The warp energy of the evolved plague can travel through sound in the specific frequency of the poxwalker's groan. It can establish a preliminary infection through a particularly vivid shared nightmare, spreading between dreaming minds through the ambient psychic network of the hive before anyone is awake enough to resist it. It can activate in individuals who reach a particular threshold of despair, not through contact with any infected person or material, but simply through having experienced enough suffering that the spiritual resistance that was protecting them finally gives way. This last vector is the most disturbing, because it removes the requirement for physical proximity to the plague at all. In a galaxy where the Great Rift has made suffering more universal, more intense, and more difficult to address, it means that the plague's potential victim pool has expanded to include virtually anyone experiencing the levels of despair that have become standard in large parts of the current Imperium. Our reboot Guilliman's return has been a significant complicating factor in all of this. The Primarch of the Ultramarines, resurrected by the mechanisms that technology, faith, and luck assembled for his survival, has been waging what he calls the Indomitus Crusade across the northern Imperium, an attempt to stabilize the regions most severely damaged by the Great Rift, reconnect isolated worlds, and re-establish the Imperium's military presence in areas where it had effectively ceased to exist. Part of this effort has involved direct confrontation with Nurgle's forces, including a campaign in Ultramar, where Mortarion himself returned to real space to try to annex the realm of Ultramar into the Garden of Nurgle. The Plague Wars of Ultramar deserve more than a summary. They were one of the defining conflicts of the New Age, and a confrontation between two impossibly powerful beings, the returned Primarch of the Ultramarines and the Demon Primarch of the Death Guard, fought out across a series of worlds that had been among the most prosperous and well-governed in the Imperium. Mortarion's approach to the Plague Wars was not merely military, it was theological, in the way that all Nurgle's greatest campaigns are theological. He did not just want to defeat Ultramar's defenses, he wanted to corrupt it. He wanted to take the shining example of what Imperial governance could be at its best. Ultramar, with its relatively well-maintained infrastructure and its comparatively high standard of living, its traditions of community, and Guilliman's own legacy of thoughtful governance, and rot it from the inside. He wanted to demonstrate that nothing is immune, or that even the best of what the Imperium has built is not sufficient against the truth of decay. The plague strains deployed in Ultramar were customized for the populations they were meant to consume. Worlds like Ajax, whose hive cities and agricultural zones had been kept in relative health by Ultramar's better-than-average administration, received plague vectors designed specifically for populations that were not as spiritually compromised as typical Imperial citizens. Strains more aggressive in their initial physical symptoms, less dependent on existing spiritual vulnerability, capable of breaching defenses that standard plague strains could not penetrate. Ajax became, within the span of the Plague Wars, one of the most comprehensively destroyed worlds in the Ultima Segmentum. Its cities, which had once served as models for how urban planning could function in the 41st millennium, became landscapes of rot and ruin. Its fields, which had fed populations across multiple worlds, became breeding grounds for plague. Its rivers ran with things that should not have been in rivers. Guilliman fought back. He fought back with everything the Imperium could assemble, with the new Primaris Space Marine forces, and the established chapters, and the Astra Militarum, and the Sisters of Battle, and, at moments of particular crisis, with something that no Primarch of his generation had expected to be able to call upon: the direct intervention of the Emperor's power, channeled through Guilliman himself in his role as the Emperor's chosen voice and hand. At the moment in which Mortarion was driven back from Ultramar involved Guilliman's forces turning the momentum of the campaign, not through a single dramatic victory, but through the sustained, grinding, inch-by-inch reclamation of contested territory, world by world and city, block by city block, maintaining protocols and discipline and faith under conditions specifically designed to destroy all three. What enabled that success? And the Ordo Sepulturum's post-campaign analysis is clear on this point, was not any technical breakthrough in plague countermeasures. The techniques the forces of Ultramar used to fight the zombie hordes and the poxwalker swarms were the same techniques that had been in the field manuals for generations. Fire, disciplined headshots, absolute burn protocols, quarantine of any casualty who took a bite or a scratch before confirmation that the body could be safely recovered. Nothing new, nothing revolutionary. What enabled the success was faith. Specifically, the faith that Guilliman's presence generated in the populations and forces of Ultramar. Not blind faith, not the faith of people who had been told to believe and complied out of fear, but genuine faith. The kind that comes from having someone you trust stand in front of you and tell you what he intends to do and then do it. The kind that comes from seeing a leader who is himself afraid. Because how could you not be afraid, fighting your corrupted brother across worlds that look increasingly like his home, and who fights anyway? The plague's mechanism requires despair. Where despair could not be generated in sufficient quantity, yet the plague's efficiency dropped dramatically. Mortal populations who maintained their spiritual integrity under conditions specifically designed to break it resisted infection at rates that the Ordo Sepulturum's models had assessed as impossible, given the strain variants being deployed. They were not impossible. They were just improbable. And improbable things happen in the 40,000 universe when someone gives people something to believe in hard enough and real enough that it actually holds. This is not an argument that faith is a magic bullet against the zombie plague. It is not. People of genuine faith still die to plague zombies when they are bitten without protection. Spiritual integrity does not make you bulletproof, or plague-proof, or immune to being overwhelmed by numbers. The curse of unbelief can still claim you if you are exposed often enough, if the physical viral load is sufficient, if you make a mistake in your protocols that lets the infection establish itself before your immune system can recognize what it is dealing with. But faith is the mechanism that slows the exponential. It is the thing that makes the mathematical cascade of infection take longer to reach the critical mass that produces collapse. And in a plague that spreads exponentially, every unit of time that the cascade is slowed represents lives saved. Thousands of them, millions, at the scale of planetary populations. The Ordo Sepulturum's current strategic priorities, as best they can be inferred from the fragments of information available, include three major lines of effort. First, maintaining and expanding the rapid response capacity to intervene in outbreak situations before the exponential phase is reached. The first 2 weeks of any outbreak are the window in which containment is possible, and after that window closes, the options narrow to the kinds of decisions that Inquisitors make, and no one else envies them. Second, continued research into the new warp-mutated strains emerging from the Great Rift environment, with particular attention to the novel transmission vectors that the post-Rift evolution has produced. Third, and most controversially within the Inquisition's internal politics, the ongoing Thorian research into the theological implications of what the plague retains of its victims, and what that retention can tell humanity about the nature of the Emperor's state and the possibility of his eventual return. That third line of effort is the one most likely to be condemned as heresy by other Inquisitors. It is also, in the Thorian faction's assessment, the most important. Because if the zombie plague and the Golden Throne share an underlying mechanism, if the same spiritual technological principle that has kept the Emperor's body from completely dying for 10 millennia is the corrupted mirror of the principle that drives the dead to rise, then understanding the plague fully might unlock the answer to the question that the Imperium has been afraid to ask for 10,000 years. Whether the Emperor is coming back, and whether the plague, of all things, holds the key to making that happen. This is heresy. Obviously, it is heresy. The Thorians know it is heresy, but they also know that all the other options have been exhausted, and that the galaxy is getting darker, and that the answer to a theological problem might be found in the most unlikely possible theological text. The biology of Nurgle's greatest weapon, turned inside out and studied under the bright, unwavering light of genuine inquiry. Whether that inquiry will produce answers, whether those answers will be usable, whether the Ordo Sepulturum will still exist to act on them by the time they arrive, these are questions that the darkness of the current era does not encourage betting on. But the inquiry continues. And somewhere in that continuation, in the simple refusal to stop asking questions, even in circumstances that have made asking questions extremely dangerous, there is something that Nurgle cannot corrupt: the desire to understand, the refusal to accept that this is simply how things are and how they must always be, the stubborn, irrational, entirely human conviction that darkness can be studied and understood, and perhaps, in ways not yet visible, addressed. That conviction is the Imperium's most ancient and most durable weapon, more ancient than the bolter, more durable than ceramite armor, more persistent than any institution, any dynasty, any individual, living or dead or somewhere in between. It is the reason the candle keeps burning, even now, even here, even in the dark. What this tells us, and what the Ordo Sepulturum's analysts emphasize in their briefings, is that the plague is not invincible. It never has been. It is extraordinarily dangerous. It is strategically devastating. Its capacity for exponential growth in vulnerable populations makes it uniquely capable of creating the conditions of its own success. But it has a consistent weakness that it has never been able to eliminate. It requires vulnerability in its victims. The curse of unbelief requires, as its fundamental condition, unbelief. Not the absence of all faith everywhere, but sufficient weakness in sufficient people to find its entry points. And faith, genuine faith, is something that the Imperium of man does generate, imperfectly and unevenly and at enormous cost, but it does generate. In every planetary defense, where the defenders held through impossible odds, in every world that managed its quarantine protocols, in every sister of battle who walked into a zombie horde with her hand steady and her faith unshaken. In every inquisitor who made the terrible decision and lived with the weight of it rather than pretending it was easy. The plague will continue. There is no optimistic interpretation of the current state of the galaxy that includes the zombie plague simply going away. Grandfather Nurgle does not give up on his children, and the billions of dead that his plague has already claimed are not going to stop walking simply because the living wish they would. The galaxy will keep producing new typhuses, new carriers, new outbreak vectors. The Death Guard will continue to walk the stars, trailing contagion behind them the way a ship trails a wake. New strains will continue to evolve as the warp energy of the Great Rift accelerates the plague's development. The Ordo Sepulturum will continue to do the only thing it can do, which is to be there when outbreaks occur and make the impossible decisions with the best information available. But there will also continue to be moments of genuine resistance, genuine survival, genuine faith, not the naive faith of someone who has never faced the darkness, but the harder, more precious faith of someone who has stood in the dark and chosen to keep their lamp burning anyway. That kind of faith is what Nurgle cannot understand, no matter how long he experiments at his cauldron. He comprehends decay. He comprehends acceptance. He comprehends the comfort of surrender. What he cannot comprehend is the human capacity to look at everything that is being taken away and decide that what remains is still worth fighting for. That is the one thing the plague cannot infect. And as long as any of it remains, and the curse of unbelief has not won. Epilogue. The darkness between the worlds. Step back from the details for a moment. Step back from the biology and the theology and the military history and the inquisitorial doctrine. Stand in that corridor where we started this, with the flickering lights and the thick air and the sound of shuffling coming from around the corner. The zombie plague, the curse of unbelief, in the end tells you something about the 40,000 universe that all its other horrors also tell you, but with particular clarity. It tells you that despair is not merely an emotional state. In a universe where the warp is real, where the collective emotional experience of sentient beings shapes the fabric of the metaphysical dimension that underlies all of reality, despair is a material force. It accumulates, it concentrates, yet it creates conditions that the powers of darkness can exploit. The Imperium of man is, among other things, an enormous despair-generating machine. Its size, its inefficiency, its brutality, its fundamental inability to provide meaningful care for the individuals who constitute its strength. All of this generates despair on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. The 41st millennium is called the grim darkness of the far future for a reason. Things are bad. They have been bad for a very long time. They do not appear to be getting better. And into that darkness, Nurgle extends his hand with his gentle, horrible offer. You are already suffering. You are already afraid. You are already in the process of losing everything. Let me take the fear away. Let me give you peace. The zombie plague is what happens when that offer is accepted, even involuntarily, even by people who never consciously chose it, even by people who prayed their hardest and their faith simply wasn't quite enough. The counter to this is also something the 40,000 universe gives us, imperfectly, brokenly, but persistently. In every corner of every Imperium record, buried under the casualty reports and the quarantine orders, and the exterminator's citations, there are moments where someone chose differently, where the darkness offered its comfortable surrender, and someone said no and meant it, and managed to hold on a little longer. Those moments matter in 40K in a way that goes beyond sentiment. They matter in the literal, metaphysical sense that the faith generated by those choices flows back into the sea of souls and sustains the light that keeps the darkness from total victory. It is not a happy universe. The zombie plague does not end. The dead do not stop walking. The carrier keeps moving across the stars with his plague fleet and his man-reaper and his 10,000 years of accumulated dedication to the task that Nurgle has given him. But somewhere, in a corridor lit by the last power cell of the last lamp, in the last defended block of a hive that has been consumed around it, someone is still holding the line. Someone is still burning the dead on schedule. Someone is still saying the prayers they were taught as a child, not because they have never doubted, but because they have decided that doubt is not the same as surrender. The galaxy is dark. The dead walk. The plague endures. And so does the light. That wraps up our deep dive into the zombie plague, the curse of unbelief, one of the most layered and narratively rich threats in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. We went from Nurgle's Garden to the corridors of Hive Tertium, from the Horus Heresy to the Great Rift, from the macro scale of planetary extinction to the intimately personal story of a psyker in a dead city who found something no one expected him to find. If this got under your skin a little, if you find yourself thinking about what you would hear from around that corner, that means it's doing what this kind of lore is supposed to do. If you want to keep going down into the dark with me, hit that subscribe button. The galaxy is enormous, and there is so much more to explore. Leave a comment below with whatever corner of 40K you want to visit next. And if this video found you at the right moment, if something in it resonated with the kind of quiet, contemplative mood that these stories are best experienced in, share it with someone who might feel the same way. The Emperor protects, even in the dark, even now.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.